The sun beat mercilessly upon Beatrice Cooper's face as she stood outside Yuma's only bookshop, clutching her worn leather journal to her chest like a shield. It was 1878, and the Arizona Territory was no place for a woman with dreams of poetry. At least that's what everyone in town seemed determined to tell her. The rejection letter in her hand trembled slightly in the hot breeze, its words cutting deeper than any knife could. Your feminine sensibilities make for quaint verses, but nothing of substance. We suggest you focus on more domestic pursuits. Beatrice tucked the letter into her journal and lifted her chin. At 22, she was old enough to know that the world was unfair, especially to women who dared to dream beyond the boundaries set for them, but young enough to still believe she could change it. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun, but a few rebellious strands had escaped, framing her face as if emphasizing her determination not to be confined. The street was busy that afternoon, dusty with horse hooves and wagon wheels. Men in varying states of respectable attire moved past her, most not bothering to acknowledge her presence. A few tipped their hats, their eyes lingering a moment too long. She was used to the attention not for her mind, but for the way her blue dress cinched at her waist or how her lips naturally curved in a way that men found appealing. "Miss Cooper," the familiar voice of Mrs. Holloway, the mayor's wife, called from across the street. "I heard about your little disappointment." The older woman's face was arranged in what was meant to be sympathy but landed somewhere closer to satisfaction. "It's just one publisher, Mrs. Holloway," Beatrice replied, forcing politeness into her voice. "There are others." "Oh, my dear Mrs. Holloway said with a chuckle that sounded like glass breaking. "Do you truly believe anyone of merit would publish the musings of a woman, especially those, how did my husband put it? Ah, yes, those foolish flights of fancy you call poetry." She patted Beatrice's arm. "Your father was a good man, God rest his soul, but he did you no favors filling your head with such ideas. A woman your age should be focused on finding a husband, not scribbling verses about the desert sky." Beatrice's jaw tightened, but she held her tongue. Her father had been the town's doctor until fever took him last winter. He had encouraged her writing, had read her poems with genuine interest, had told her that her words mattered. Without him, Yuma felt like a cage growing smaller by the day. "Thank you for your concern," Beatrice finally said, the words tasting like sand in her mouth. Mrs. Holloway nodded, satisfied that her message had been delivered, and continued on her way to the general store. Beatrice watched her go, then turned toward home, the small house she now shared with her elderly aunt who had come to Yuma to care for her after her father's death. As she walked, the wind picked up, sending a sheet of paper flying from her journal. She grabbed for it, but the breeze carried it out of reach, sending it tumbling down the street. Beatrice hitched up her skirts and ran after it, ignoring the disapproving glances of the women outside the millinery shop. The paper danced on the wind, finally catching on the spur of a boot belonging to a man Beatrice had never seen before. He was tall, with broad shoulders and dark blonde hair that curled slightly at the ends. His face was tanned from the sun, and when he bent to retrieve her poem, she could see his eyes were a striking green, like the rare rainfall on desert sage. "This yours, madam?" he asked, his voice deep and smooth with a hint of a southern drawl. "Yes, thank you," Beatrice replied, slightly out of breath from her chase. She reached for the paper, but he held it just beyond her grasp, his eyes scanning the words written there. "The desert speaks in whispers, not in shouts," he read aloud, his voice giving her words a richness she'd never heard before. "Its beauty revealed in silence to those who dare to listen." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers with a curiosity that seemed genuine. You wrote this. I did, she admitted, waiting for the mockery that usually followed when men discovered her passion. Instead, he handed the paper back to her with unexpected gentleness. It's beautiful, he said simply. Makes me see the desert in a way I never considered before. Beatrice stared at him, caught off guard by his sincerity. Most people in Yuma don't share your appreciation for my work. Most people in Yuma probably don't take the time to listen to what the desert's saying, he replied with a small smile. He removed his hat, revealing more of that golden hair. Yancey Donovan, madam, just rode in from Texas. Beatrice Cooper, she replied, tucking the poem safely back into her journal. What brings you to Yuma, Mr. Donovan? Work mostly, he said, replacing his hat. I've been hired to help with the Carlson Ranch. They're expanding their operation, need experienced hands. He nodded toward her journal. You have more like that one, more poems. Yes, I have quite a few. I'd like to read them sometime, he said, and for the first time in months, Beatrice felt a flutter of something like hope in her chest. Donovan. A voice called from down the street. Marshall's looking for you. Yancey nodded at the man who'd called him, then turned back to Beatrice. Duty calls, Miss Cooper, but I meant what I said about your writing. He tipped his hat to her and walked away, his spurs making a rhythmic sound against the hard, packed dirt. Beatrice watched him go, wondering if he was simply being polite or if he truly had an interest in her poetry. Either way, it was a rare moment of kindness in a town that seemed determined to stifle her voice. When she reached home, her Aunt Martha was sitting on the porch, her knitting needles clicking steadily. At 65, Martha Cooper was a practical woman who had never married, choosing instead to teach school in Tucson for 40 years before retiring to care for her orphaned niece. You're late, Martha observed without looking up from her work. Another rejection. Beatrice sank into the chair beside her aunt. Yes, the Western Literary Review said my work lacks substance. Martha's needles never slowed. And what do you think? I think they never gave it a real chance, Beatrice admitted. But I met someone today who seemed to actually appreciate my poetry. Oh, now Martha looked up, her faded blue eyes sharp with interest. A new suitor, Beatrice shook her head. Just a cowboy passing through, he's working at the Carlson Ranch. Well, Martha said, returning to her knitting, cowboys come and go, don't pin your hopes on his opinion, dear. I know, Beatrice sighed, but it was nice to be taken seriously, even for a moment. The next day, Beatrice went to the post office with 3 more submissions to Eastern publishers. The postmaster, Mr. Finch, barely concealed his amusement as he weighed each envelope. More poetry, Miss Cooper? He asked, his thin lips twisted in a smirk. You're certainly persistent. I prefer to think of it as determined, Mr. Finch, she replied coolly. As she turned to leave, she almost collided with Yancey Donovan, who was entering the post office with a letter in hand. Miss Cooper, he greeted her, his smile genuine. Sending out more of your work, trying to, she admitted, though I suspect these will meet the same fate as the others. Their loss, he said simply. Then, after a moment's hesitation, I was wondering if you might join me for coffee at the hotel restaurant. I have a break before I need to head back to the ranch. Beatrice was aware of Mr. Finch's ears practically stretching to catch their conversation. A respectable young woman wouldn't accept such an invitation from a man she barely knew, especially not a cowboy. But something about Yancey Donovan's straightforward manner made her want to break the rules, just this once. I'd like that, Mr. Donovan. The hotel restaurant was relatively quiet at mid-morning. A few travelers sat at tables near the window, and a businessman read a newspaper in the corner. Yancey led Beatrice to a table near the back, pulling out her chair with a courtesy that seemed natural rather than practiced. Once they were seated with coffee before them, Yancey leaned forward slightly. "I've been thinking about your poem since yesterday." "You have?" Beatrice couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. Yes, there was something in those lines, a way of seeing beauty in things most people overlook. He took a sip of his coffee. "I've been riding these territories for nearly 10 years now, and I never thought much about the desert except as something to endure. Your words made me look at it differently on my ride back to the ranch last night." Beatrice felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. "Thank you. Most people here think my poetry is foolish, a waste of time. People tend to dismiss what they don't understand," Yancey replied, "or what makes them uncomfortable. And my poetry makes people uncomfortable." He considered this for a moment. "I think a woman with thoughts of her own makes people uncomfortable. Your poetry is just the evidence of those thoughts." Beatrice studied him across the table. At perhaps 28 or 30, he was older than her by several years, but not so much as to be inappropriate. There was an intelligence in his eyes that contradicted the common perception of cowboys as uneducated drifters. "What about you, Mr. Donovan? Do independent women make you uncomfortable?" He smiled, revealing a dimple in his right cheek. "On the contrary, Miss Cooper, I find them fascinating." Their conversation flowed easily after that. Yancey told her about growing up in Virginia, about losing his family's land after the war, about working his way west as a cowhand. Beatrice shared stories of her father, of growing up as a doctor's daughter in a frontier town, of finding solace in books and poetry when her mother died giving birth to a stillborn brother when Beatrice was 12. "Is that when you started writing?" he asked. "No, I'd been writing since I was very young," she answered. "But that's when I started taking it seriously. Words became a way to make sense of what happened, to find meaning in loss. Before they knew it, an hour had passed." Yancey glanced at the clock on the wall and sighed. "I should get back to the ranch," he said reluctantly. "Mr. Carlson isn't the most patient employer." As they stood to leave, Yancey hesitated. Would you consider letting me read more of your poetry?" Beatrice bit her lip, suddenly shy. "You really want to?" "I do." His sincerity was unmistakable. After a moment's consideration, Beatrice opened her journal and carefully tore out a page containing a poem she'd written the previous week. "Here," she said, handing it to him. "It's not my best work, but—" "I'll treasure it," he said, folding the paper carefully and placing it in his shirt pocket. "And I hope you'll share more with me soon." As they stepped out onto the boardwalk, Beatrice was acutely aware of the curious glances from passers-by. A young, unmarried woman having coffee with a cowboy was sure to set tongues wagging, especially in a town as small as Yuma. "I've given you cause for gossip," Yancey observed, following her gaze to where two women were whispering behind their hands. "Yuma finds plenty to gossip about without our help," Beatrice replied with a small smile. "But perhaps we should be more discreet in the future." "Does that mean there will be a future, Miss Cooper?" There was a hopeful note in his voice that made Beatrice's heart beat a little faster. "I think I'd like that, Mr. Donovan." For the next 2 weeks, Yancey found reasons to come into town every few days. Sometimes they would meet at the bookshop, where the kindly owner, Mr. Abernathy, turned a blind eye to their conversations among the shelves. Other times, they would walk by the river in the cooler evening hours, talking about books and poetry and life. Each time, Beatrice would share another poem with Yancey, and each time he would listen with genuine interest, often asking questions that showed he truly understood what she was trying to express. It was a revelation to find someone who valued her words, who saw them not as the frivolous pastime of a woman with too much time on her hands, but as something of worth. "You should be published," he told her one evening as they sat on a bench overlooking the Colorado River. The setting sun painted the water in shades of gold and crimson, a sight that never failed to inspire Beatrice. "Your words deserve to be read by more than just me. The publishers don't agree with you," she sighed, watching a bird skim low over the water's surface. "Then they're fools," Yancey said with unexpected vehemence. "Just like the people in this town who mock what they're too small-minded to appreciate." Beatrice turned to look at him, surprised by his passion. "You really believe in my writing that much?" "I do." He took her hand then, his calloused palm warm against her skin. "I believe in you, Beatrice." The way he said her name, like it was something precious, sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. They had been careful to maintain propriety in their meetings, but in that moment, Beatrice found herself wishing he would kiss her. As if reading her thoughts, Yancey leaned closer, his eyes asking a question. Beatrice gave a small nod, and then his lips were on hers, gentle but sure. It was her first kiss, and it was nothing like she had imagined. It was better warm and sweet and full of promise. When they pulled apart, Yancey rested his forehead against hers for a moment. "I've been wanting to do that since I first read your words," he admitted softly. "I'm glad you did," she whispered back. Their quiet moment was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. They moved apart quickly, Yancey standing to see who was coming. A group of cowboys from the Carlson Ranch rode into view, their laughter carrying across the evening air. "Donovan," one called out. "Thought you were heading back to the ranch. Didn't know you were courting the doc's daughter." Yancey's stance stiffened slightly, but his voice remained even. "Just enjoying the evening, Hayes. Miss Cooper was kind enough to share some of her poetry." This announcement was met with snickers from the group. "Poetry," Hayes repeated, his tone making the words sound dirty somehow. "Well, ain't you cultured all of a sudden? Boss wants all hands back at the ranch. Seems some of the cattle broke through the north fence." "I'll be right there," Yancey replied, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. Hayes and the others rode on, their laughter floating back to where Beatrice and Yancey stood. Beatrice felt the familiar sting of humiliation. It was one thing for her to face mockery, but now Yancey was being ridiculed because of her. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "For what?" Yancey looked genuinely confused. "For making you a target of their jokes." Yancey shook his head, taking her hands in his. "Beatrice, men like that have been trying to make me feel small my whole life. First because my family lost everything in the war, then because I had to work as a ranch hand instead of going to university like my father wanted." He squeezed her hands gently. "Their opinions mean nothing to me." "Yours does." The sincerity in his eyes made her throat tight with emotion. "I should get home before Aunt Martha sends out a search party." "I'll walk you," Yancey offered, tucking her hand into the crook of his arm. As they made their way back toward town, Beatrice felt a lightness in her step that had been missing for too long. Perhaps Yuma wasn't such a cage after all, not if it had brought Yancey Donovan into her life. The next morning, Beatrice was arranging flowers in the front parlor when a sharp knock came at the door. She opened it to find Mrs. Carlson, the ranch owner's wife, standing on the porch, her face set in severe lines. "Miss Cooper," she said without preamble, "I'll come straight to the point. My husband and I have heard disturbing reports about your association with one of our ranch hands." Beatrice felt her cheeks grow warm, but she kept her voice steady. "Mr. Donovan and I are acquainted, yes." "More than acquainted from what I hear," Mrs. Carlson replied coldly. "Meeting unchaperoned, exchanging poetry." She said the word as if it were profanity. "It's unseemly, Miss Cooper, and it's disrupting work at the ranch. The men are talking. I don't see how my friendship with Mr. Donovan is any concern of yours, Mrs." Carlson, Beatrice replied, her embarrassment giving way to indignation. It becomes my concern when it affects my husband's business, Mrs. Carlson snapped. Donovan is one of our best hands, but he's been distracted, coming into town every chance he gets. And now the other men are teasing him, causing tension. I'm sorry to hear that, Beatrice said, not feeling sorry at all, but I still don't see what you expect me to do about it. Mrs. Carlson drew herself up to her full height, which was still several inches shorter than Beatrice. I expect you to act like a lady of good breeding and stop encouraging his attentions. You're the daughter of a respected physician, not some saloon girl to be dallying with cowboys. Anger flashed through Beatrice, hot and sharp. Mr. Donovan has shown me nothing but respect and kindness, which is more than I can say for many of the so-called respectable citizens of this town. Kindness. Mrs. Carlson gave a short, harsh laugh. My dear, men like Donovan only show kindness to women like you when they want something, and we both know what that something usually is. Beatrice's hand tightened on the doorknob. I think you should leave now, Mrs. Carlson. Just remember, the older woman said as she turned to go, men like that drift from town to town. They don't put down roots, and they certainly don't marry women who waste their time writing foolish verses instead of learning how to keep a proper home. After Mrs. Carlson left, Beatrice closed the door and leaned against it, her heart pounding with anger and hurt. Was that how everyone saw her relationship with Yancey? As something sordid and improper? And worse, was Mrs. Carlson right about Yancey's intentions? No, she decided firmly. She had seen the truth in Yancey's eyes, had felt the genuine respect in his touch. He wasn't like the others in this town, quick to judge and dismiss her dreams. That evening, Aunt Martha returned from her weekly quilting circle with pursed lips and a worried frown. The town is talking, Beatrice, she said as they prepared dinner together. About you and that cowboy. His name is Yancey Donovan, Beatrice replied, slicing bread with more force than necessary. And I don't care what the town says. You should care, Martha said gently. A woman's reputation is fragile, especially in a place like Yuma. Once damaged, it's nearly impossible to repair. Because I've been seen walking with a man who appreciates my writing, Beatrice asked incredulously. That's hardly scandalous, Aunt Martha. It's more than that, and you know it, Martha replied. He's a drifter, Beatrice, a hired hand with no prospects. Even if his intentions are honorable, which I'm not convinced they are, what kind of future could he offer you? The question hung in the air between them. It was one Beatrice had been avoiding in her own thoughts, pushing aside practical considerations in favor of the joy she felt in Yancey's company. I don't know, she finally admitted. But is the alternative any better? To marry some local merchant who thinks my poetry is foolish? To spend my life with someone who doesn't understand the most important part of who I am? Martha's expression softened. Oh, my dear, I don't want you to settle for less than you deserve. I just don't want to see you hurt either by this man or by the cruelty of small-town gossip. Beatrice set down the knife and wiped her hands on her apron. I know you're worried for me, Aunt Martha, but Yancey is different from anyone I've ever met. He sees me, really sees me, not as Dr. Cooper's daughter or as a potential wife, but as a poet with something meaningful to say. Martha studied her niece's face for a long moment. You're falling in love with him, aren't you? The question caught Beatrice by surprise, forcing her to confront feelings she'd been too cautious to name. I think I might be, she admitted softly. Then be careful, Martha advised. Not just with your reputation, but with your heart. It's the most precious thing you have to give. 2 days passed with no sign of Yancey in town. Beatrice tried not to worry, telling herself he was simply busy at the ranch. But on the third day, as she was leaving the general store, she spotted him riding down the main street. Her heart leapt at the sight of him, then faltered when she saw the grim set of his jaw. He dismounted in front of her, removing his hat. "Beatrice," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger, "I need to speak with you." "Of course," she replied, concern washing over her. "What's wrong?" "Not here," he said, glancing around at the curious onlookers. "Is there somewhere private we can talk?" Beatrice hesitated only briefly before saying, "We can go to my home. Aunt Martha is visiting a friend this afternoon." They walked in tense silence to the Cooper house, Yancey leading his horse by the reins. Once they were inside with the door closed against prying eyes, he turned to her. "Did Mrs. Carlson come to see you?" he asked without preamble. Beatrice nodded. "Yes, a few days ago. How did you know?" "Because Mr. Carlson called me into his office yesterday," Yancey replied, his voice hard. "Told me I was becoming a disruption to ranch operations. Said his wife had taken it upon herself to warn you about me. She suggested your intentions were less than honorable," Beatrice admitted, watching his face carefully. Anger flashed in Yancey's green eyes. "And did you believe her?" "No," Beatrice said firmly. "Not for a moment." Some of the tension left his shoulders at her words. "Carlson gave me an ultimatum. Stop seeing you or find another job." Beatrice felt as if the floor had dropped away beneath her feet. "And what did you say?" "I told him I'd have my things packed by sundown." Yancey's voice was steady, but Beatrice could see the cost of his decision in the tight line of his mouth. "Yancey, no," she breathed. "You shouldn't have to choose between your livelihood and what, Beatrice?" he asked, taking a step closer to her. "What exactly am I choosing?" She looked up at him, her heart pounding. "And me," she whispered. "Between your job and me." "It wasn't much of a choice," he said, his voice softening. "Not when I've spent every night for the past 2 weeks falling asleep with your words in my head, waking up with them still there." He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out several folded papers, the poems she had given him, creased and worn from constant reading. "You kept them all," she said, touched by the sight. "Of course I did." He carefully put the poems back in his pocket. "They're the most precious things I own." Beatrice felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. "But what will you do now? Where will you go?" "I don't know yet," he admitted. "I have some savings, enough to get by for a while." He took another step toward her, close enough now that she could smell the leather and sunshine scent of him. "But I couldn't leave without telling you how I feel, Beatrice, without asking if there might be a chance for us, a future together." Her breath caught in her throat. Are you proposing, Yancey Donovan?" A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I'm asking if you'd be open to the possibility someday, when I've found steady work, when I can offer you more than just pretty words and an uncertain tomorrow." Beatrice reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "Your words aren't just pretty, Yancey. They're honest. And sometimes honesty is worth more than certainty." He caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "I love you, Beatrice Cooper. I know it's fast. I know it doesn't make practical sense, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life." "I love you too," she whispered, the words both terrifying and liberating to say aloud. "But I don't want to be the reason you lose your position at the ranch." "You're not the reason," he said firmly. "Carlson's small-mindedness is the reason, and I would have had to move on eventually anyway. Ranch work is always seasonal, always changing." "Then where will you go?" she asked again. Yancey hesitated. "I heard there's work in Tucson. Good work with the possibility of advancement. I could find a place there, get established, and then when the time is right." "Tucson is so far," Beatrice said, her heart sinking at the thought of him leaving. "Not so very far," he countered, "and I'd write to you every week." "You would, of course, and maybe you could write back, send me more of your poetry." His eyes lit up with sudden inspiration. In fact, that's what I want most. Write me more poems, Beatrice. Let me carry your words with me until we can be together again. The sincerity in his voice moved her deeply. Here was a man who truly valued her gift, who wanted her words as much as he wanted her presence. I will, she promised. I'll write you every poem that comes to my heart. He kissed her then, more deeply than before, his arms wrapping around her waist to pull her close. Beatrice responded with a fervor that surprised even herself, her hands sliding up his chest to circle his neck. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Yancey rested his forehead against hers. I should go, he said reluctantly, before your aunt returns and finds me here, further damaging your reputation. When will you leave for Tucson? She asked, not wanting to release him just yet. Tomorrow morning. I've already made arrangements to stay at the hotel tonight. He pulled back slightly to look into her eyes. Will you see me off? Yes, she said without hesitation. Nothing could keep me away. The next morning dawned clear and already warm, promising another scorching Arizona day. Beatrice dressed with care, choosing a blue dress that Yancey had once complimented. She pinned her hair up neatly, though she let a few curls frame her face the way she knew he liked. Aunt Martha watched her preparations with resigned concern. You're sure about this, Beatrice? Seeing him publicly after all the talk? I'm sure, Beatrice replied, securing a small hat with a pin. The town will talk regardless. At least this way they'll be talking about something real. When she arrived at the hotel, Yancey was already outside, his few possessions packed on a sturdy brown horse. He smiled when he saw her, that special smile that seemed reserved just for her. You came, he said, taking her gloved hands in his. I said I would, she replied, trying to memorize every detail of his face, knowing it would be weeks or months before she saw it again. People were watching, of course. Mrs. Holloway and her circle were across the street, pretending to admire fabric in the dressmaker's window while actually staring openly at Beatrice and Yancey. A few of the cowboys from the Carlson ranch leaned against the hitching post in front of the saloon, their expressions varying from amusement to disapproval. But for once, Beatrice didn't care about their judgment. She reached into her reticule and pulled out a small packet tied with ribbon. These are for you, she said, pressing the bundle into Yancey's hands. New poems. I wrote them all last night. Yancey looked at the packet as if she'd handed him gold. I'll treasure them, he promised, and read them every night. This isn't goodbye, Beatrice said firmly. It's just. Until later. Until later, he agreed. Then, to the shock of everyone watching, he pulled her into his arms and kissed her, right there on the main street of Yuma for all to see. Gasps and murmurs erupted from the onlookers, but Beatrice barely heard them. All she could focus on was the feel of Yancey's lips on hers, the strength of his arms around her, the promise in his touch. When they separated, his eyes were bright with emotion. I'll write as soon as I reach Tucson, he promised. And I'll come back for you, Beatrice Cooper. Count on it. Then he mounted his horse, tipped his hat to her one last time, and rode out of Yuma, the morning sun glinting off his golden hair. Beatrice stood watching until he was nothing but a speck on the horizon. Only then did she become fully aware of the stares and whispers surrounding her. With her head held high, she turned and walked home, ignoring the scandalized faces of Yuma's respectable citizens. When she arrived home, Aunt Martha was waiting on the porch. Well, the older woman said, taking in Beatrice's flushed cheeks and bright eyes, I suppose it's done now. Yes, Beatrice replied, a strange calm settling over her. It's done, and I don't regret a moment of it. Martha sighed, but there was a hint of admiration in her gaze. You always were your father's daughter, stubborn as the day is long. She held open the door. Come inside. There's a letter for you. Beatrice followed her aunt into the house, curious. A letter from whom? See for yourself. Martha handed her an envelope bearing the letterhead of Harper and Brothers Publishers in New York. With shaking hands, Beatrice opened it, scanning the contents quickly. A small cry escaped her lips. "What is it?" Martha asked, alarmed. "Bad news." "No," Beatrice whispered, reading the letter again to be sure. "No, it's wonderful news. They want to publish my poems, a whole collection of them." Martha's eyes widened in genuine surprise. "The New York publisher. They're going to publish your poetry." "Yes," Beatrice laughed, the joy of it bubbling up inside her like a spring. "They say my voice is refreshingly authentic and my perspective on frontier life is uniquely compelling." Martha's face broke into a rare, wide smile. "Oh, my dear girl, your father would be so proud." Beatrice clutched the letter to her chest, wishing desperately that Yancey were still here to share in her triumph. But he would know soon enough, she promised herself. This would be the first thing she wrote to him about. The weeks that followed were a strange mixture of isolation and possibility for Beatrice. True to her expectations, the town's gossip mill had gone into overdrive after her public display with Yancey. Several families who had previously welcomed her into their homes now found excuses not to invite her for tea or dinner. Mrs. Holloway and her circle crossed the street to avoid speaking to her directly, though they had no qualms about discussing her fall from grace within her hearing. Yet alongside this social ostracism came a newfound freedom. With her reputation already compromised in the eyes of Yuma society, Beatrice found herself caring less about their opinions. She wrote more boldly, exploring themes and emotions she might have previously censored. And when the first letter arrived from Yancey, just 8 days after his departure, she read it openly on the front porch, unconcerned with who might see her smiling over a Cowboy's correspondence. His letter was everything she had hoped for: warm, thoughtful, and full of details about his journey and his first impressions of Tucson. He had found work with a cattle company that was expanding its operations, a position that offered more responsibility and better pay than his job at the Carlson Ranch. "The foreman here values education," Yancey wrote. "When he learned I had some schooling before the war, he suggested I might advance to a management position if I prove myself. For the first time in years, Beatrice, I can see a future beyond just the next season's work, a future that might be worthy of sharing with you." She wrote back immediately, telling him about the publisher's acceptance and enclosing 3 new poems she had written since his departure. One was about the desert at dawn, another about the Colorado River's journey through the canyon. But the third was about him, about the way his smile made her feel, about the respect in his eyes when he read her words. Their correspondence continued through the hot summer months and into the cooler days of autumn. Each letter from Yancey was carefully preserved in a special box, along with copies of the poems she sent him. He responded to every verse with thoughtful observations, sometimes quoting lines that had particularly moved him. "Your words have a way of getting under a man's skin," he wrote in late September. "I find myself reciting them as I ride, the rhythm of the lines matching the pace of my horse. The other men think I've gone a bit mad, but I don't mind. Your poetry has taught me to see beauty where I never thought to look for it before." In October, exciting news arrived from Harper and Brothers. They had finalized the details for her book, which would be titled Desert Whispers, Poems of the Arizona Territory. It would be published in the spring, with an initial printing of 500 copies, a modest number, but more than Beatrice had ever dreamed possible. The letter also contained the first payment for her work, a sum that made both Beatrice and Aunt Martha gasp in surprise. "Why, that's more than your father made in 2 months of doctoring," Martha exclaimed, staring at the bank draft. "What should I do with it?" Beatrice wondered aloud. Having never had so much money of her own before, Martha considered the question seriously. "Save most of it," she advised. "A woman with her own money has choices that others don't, but perhaps use a small portion to celebrate your achievement." Beatrice thought about this, then made her decision. The very next day, she went to the dressmaker and ordered a new dress, not the practical, serviceable kind she usually wore, but something elegant in a deep emerald green that reminded her of Yancey's eyes. It was an extravagance, certainly, but one that felt right. Her life was changing, and she wanted something tangible to mark that transformation. When Yancey's next letter arrived in early November, it contained news that made her heart race. "I've been promoted," he wrote. "The company is opening a new office in Yuma this winter, and they've asked me to help establish it. I'll be arriving on the 20th of this month, not as a drifting cowhand this time, but as a junior manager with prospects for advancement. The position comes with a small house on the edge of town, nothing grand, but a proper home with 2 bedrooms and a kitchen that gets morning light. The kind of place where a man might start a family if he were fortunate enough to find a woman who would have him." Beatrice read the last lines over and over, her hands trembling slightly. Was this the proposal she had been hoping for? It seemed so, though Yancey was still being careful not to presume too much. She wrote back immediately, telling him how proud she was of his advancement and how much she was looking forward to seeing him again. She stopped short of directly addressing his hint about marriage, feeling that such a conversation should happen in person. But she made her feelings clear in a new poem that spoke of building homes not just of wood and stone, but of shared dreams and mutual respect. The days until November 20th seemed to crawl by. Beatrice found herself unable to focus on her writing, her thoughts constantly drifting to Yancey and his imminent return. Would he have changed? Would the feelings between them be as strong in person as they had been in their letters? On the morning of the 20th, she put on her new green dress, arranged her hair with special care, and walked to the stagecoach office with Aunt Martha at her side. The older woman had gradually warmed to the idea of Yancey over the months of their correspondence, impressed by his consistent devotion to Beatrice and his improving prospects. "You look beautiful," Martha said as they waited, straightening the collar of Beatrice's dress with maternal concern. "And nervous, I am," Beatrice admitted. "It's been almost 5 months, but you've exchanged how many letters in that time? 20? 30. You know each other's minds better now than many couples who see each other daily." This was true, Beatrice realized. Through their written words, she and Yancey had shared thoughts and feelings that might have taken years to express in person. There was an intimacy to their correspondence that transcended physical presence. The sound of the approaching stagecoach interrupted her thoughts. Dust billowed as the vehicle clattered to a stop, and then the door was opening, passengers descending one by one. And then there he was. Yancey looked different, somehow more polished in his new suit and hat, his hair trimmed neatly, his face freshly shaved. But his eyes were the same, that clear green that had haunted her dreams for months. And when those eyes found hers in the crowd, the smile that spread across his face was purely, wonderfully familiar. He strode toward her, seeming not to notice anyone else around them. "Beatrice," he said, his voice wrapping around her name like a caress. "Yancey," she replied, suddenly shy despite all the intimate thoughts they had shared in their letters. "Welcome back to Yuma." For a moment, they simply looked at each other, drinking in the reality of being in the same place again after so many months apart. Then, mindful of their audience and Aunt Martha's presence, Yancey took Beatrice's hand and raised it to his lips in a gesture that managed to be both proper and deeply intimate. "You're even more beautiful than I remembered," he said softly. "And you're more handsome," she replied, taking in his new appearance. "Management seems to agree with you," he laughed, the sound warming her from within. "It's different work than I'm used to, that's for certain. Less dust, more paperwork." He turned to acknowledge Aunt Martha with a respectful nod. "Miss Cooper, it's good to see you again. Thank you for accompanying Beatrice today." Martha's usual reserve softened slightly. "Mr. Donovan, you're looking well. I understand congratulations are in order for your new position." "Thank you, madam. I'm grateful for the opportunity." He glanced back at Beatrice, his eyes lingering on her face. "Very grateful." "Well," Martha said after a moment, "I imagine you two have much to discuss. Perhaps we could all have dinner this evening at our home, say 6 o'clock. "I would be honored," Yancey replied with genuine pleasure. "Good. Now I need to visit the apothecary before heading home." Martha gave Beatrice a meaningful look. "I trust you'll remember that you're in a public place despite your previous displays." Beatrice felt her cheeks warm at the reminder of their scandalous goodbye. "Yes, Aunt Martha." As Martha walked away, Yancey offered Beatrice his arm. "Shall we take a walk? I'd like to show you the company office. It's not much yet, but we're making progress." She placed her hand on his arm, feeling the solid strength of him beneath the new suit. "I'd like that very much." They walked through town, aware of the curious stares following them but no longer concerned by them. Yancey pointed out the small building that was being converted into the cattle company's Yuma office, explaining how it would serve as a coordination point for shipments moving between Tucson and California. "It's not the most exciting work," he admitted as they continued their walk toward the river, "but it's stable, and there's room for advancement as the company grows." "You don't miss being on horseback all day, the open range?" Beatrice asked, genuinely curious. She had always thought of him as a man who belonged outdoors. "Sometimes," he said thoughtfully, "but I spent 10 years drifting from ranch to ranch, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. I'm ready for something different now." He stopped walking and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Something permanent." Beatrice's heart quickened at the intensity in his gaze. "Yancey, let me say this properly," he interrupted gently. "I've been rehearsing it for weeks." He took a deep breath. "Beatrice Cooper, I've carried your words with me for months now. They've been my comfort when I was lonely, my joy when I was happy, my inspiration when I needed courage. But as beautiful as your poetry is, I want more than just your words. I want your smile across the breakfast table every morning. I want your voice reading those poems aloud to me by the fire at night. I want your hand in mine as we build a life together." He squeezed her hands gently. "I love you. Will you marry me?" Tears filled Beatrice's eyes, but they were tears of happiness. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, Yancey Donovan, I will marry you." His smile was radiant as he pulled her into his arms, propriety momentarily forgotten as he kissed her with all the passion that had built during their months apart. When they finally separated, both breathless, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "I bought this in Tucson," he said, opening it to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a small pearl. "It's not a diamond, I'm afraid. That will have to wait until my circumstances improve further. But I wanted you to have something to mark our engagement." "It's beautiful," Beatrice whispered as he slipped it onto her finger. "Perfect." They spent the next hour walking by the river, making plans for their future together. Yancey had already spoken to the minister about a wedding in January, after the holiday season, but before the spring rush of cattle business began. The company house would be ready by then, a modest but comfortable home where they could begin their married life. "And your book will be published in the spring," Yancey reminded her. "My wife, the published poet. I couldn't be prouder." The word wife sent a thrill through Beatrice. It was actually happening. The dream she had scarcely dared to hope for was becoming reality. When they arrived at the Cooper house that evening for dinner, Aunt Martha took one look at their glowing faces and the ring on Beatrice's finger and nodded in satisfaction. "Well," she said, "I suppose I should start planning a wedding." Over dinner, they discussed the practical aspects of their engagement. Yancey formally asked for Beatrice's hand, a gesture that clearly pleased Martha despite her attempts to remain pragmatic. "You have my blessing," she told him, "on the condition that you continue to encourage Beatrice's writing. Her gift is too precious to be set aside for domestic duties alone." "I wouldn't dream of asking her to stop writing," Yancey assured her. "Her poetry is part of who she is, part of why I love her." As the weeks passed, Beatrice found herself caught up in a whirlwind of wedding preparations alongside the excitement of her forthcoming book. The town's attitude toward her had begun to shift subtly since Yancey's return. His position with the cattle company gave him a respectability he hadn't possessed as a ranch hand, and their official engagement transformed what had been seen as a scandalous liaison into an acceptable courtship. Even Mrs. Holloway, who had been one of her harshest critics, now acknowledged Beatrice on the street with a stiff nod. The woman stopped her outside the church one Sunday in December with what passed for an apology in her world. "I may have been hasty in my judgment, Miss Cooper," she said, her voice pitched to carry to those nearby. "Mr. Donovan appears to be a man of character after all, and I understand Harper and Brothers will be publishing your poetry. Perhaps there is merit in your writing that we've overlooked." Beatrice recognized the woman's words for what they were: not a genuine change of heart, but an acknowledgement that Beatrice had succeeded despite the town's disapproval. Still, she responded with grace. "Thank you, Mrs. Holloway. I hope you'll read my collection when it's published. I've tried to capture the beauty of our territory, including Yuma." The wedding was set for January 15, 1879, a date that approached with increasing speed. Beatrice and Yancey spent every free moment together, sometimes talking for hours about their hopes for the future, sometimes simply enjoying each other's presence as she wrote, and he reviewed paperwork for the company. On Christmas Eve, Yancey presented her with a gift that brought tears to her eyes: a beautiful leather-bound journal, stamped with her initials in gold leaf. "For your new poems," he said as she ran her fingers over the supple cover. "The ones you'll write as my wife." "I have something for you too," she said, handing him a package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Inside was a hand-knitted scarf in a deep blue that complemented his eyes, and beneath it, a single sheet of paper containing a poem she had written especially for him. It spoke of two souls finding each other across the vast expanse of the desert, of words bridging the distance between hearts, of love that transformed both the lover and the beloved. Yancey read it silently, his eyes moving over the lines with a reverence that touched her deeply. When he finished, he looked up at her with such tenderness that words seemed unnecessary. He kissed her gently, the promise of their future together sealed in that moment of perfect understanding. January 15th dawned clear and cool, the Arizona winter at its most benevolent. Beatrice stood in her childhood bedroom, looking at herself in the mirror as Aunt Martha fastened the last buttons on her wedding dress. It was cream-colored satin, simple in design but elegant in its lines, with lace at the collar and cuffs that had once adorned her mother's wedding gown. "Your parents would be so proud," Martha said, her usual practicality softened by emotion. "Especially your father. He always knew you were meant for something special." "I wish they could be here," Beatrice said softly, but I'm so grateful to have you, Aunt Martha." The older woman brushed a speck of invisible dust from Beatrice's shoulder. "I've done my best," she said. "When your father asked me to come care for you, I wasn't sure I was up to the task. I'd spent my life teaching other people's children, never having any of my own. But you've become like a daughter to me, Beatrice. And you've been the mother I needed," Beatrice replied, embracing her aunt carefully to avoid wrinkling her dress. "Thank you for everything." A knock at the front door interrupted their moment. Martha went to answer it, returning with a small package. "For you," she said, handing it to Beatrice. "From your groom, I presume." Beatrice opened the package to find a delicate silver locket. Inside was a tiny scrap of paper, folded to fit the small space. When she carefully unfolded it, she recognized the lines from the first poem of hers that Yancey had ever read, the one about the desert speaking in whispers. A note accompanied the gift. "Wear this today as a reminder of how our story began, with your words and my listening heart. All my love, Yancey." The church was filled to capacity for the ceremony, not just with the few friends who had stood by Beatrice through the difficult months, but also with many of the same townspeople who had once whispered behind their hands about her inappropriate relationship with a drifter. Now they watched with approval as she walked down the aisle toward Yancey, who stood waiting for her with undisguised adoration in his eyes. The minister spoke of partnership and respect, of building a life founded on mutual admiration. When it came time for their vows, Yancey surprised Beatrice by reciting his from-memory words he had written himself that echoed the rhythms of her poetry, promising not just his love and fidelity, but his unwavering support for her writing and her dreams. Beatrice, too emotional to trust her memory, read her vows from a small card, promising to love Yancey through all the seasons of their life together, to be his partner in both joy and hardship, to create with him a home where both could flourish. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Yancey kissed her with a restraint that spoke of his awareness of their surroundings, but with enough warmth to bring a flush to her cheeks and a few knowing smiles from the congregation. The reception was held at the hotel restaurant, decorated with winter greenery and white ribbons for the occasion. As Beatrice and Yancey moved among their guests, accepting congratulations and well wishes, she was struck by how much had changed in less than a year. From the lonely young woman whose poetry was dismissed as foolish to a soon-to-be-published author and a beloved wife, the transformation seemed almost too much to believe. "Happy?" Yancey asked as they shared the first dance, his hand warm and steady at her waist. "Completely," she answered, looking up into his face, the face that had become as dear and necessary to her as her own reflection. "Are you?" "More than I ever thought possible," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "When I rode into Yuma last year, I was just looking for work, for a way to survive until the next season. I never expected to find you, to find this kind of happiness." As the celebration continued around them, Beatrice found a moment to stand by one of the windows, watching the winter sun begin its early descent. Yancey joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. "What are you thinking, Mrs. Donovan?" he asked, the new name sending a pleasant shiver through her. "That I want to remember every detail of this day," she replied, "so I can write about it someday when we're old and gray." He smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Always the poet. It's how I make sense of the world," she said. "Through words. And I'm grateful for it," he replied. "If you hadn't been brave enough to keep writing despite what everyone said, if that page hadn't blown from your journal that day." He shook his head, marveling at the chain of circumstances that had brought them together. "We found each other," Beatrice said simply, "and we recognized what we saw." As the evening drew to a close, they slipped away to the small house that was now their home. It was modestly furnished but welcoming, with bookshelves Yancey had built himself and curtains Martha had sewn as a wedding gift. A fire had been laid in the hearth, ready to be lit against the January chill. Crossing the threshold as husband and wife, they stood for a moment in the quiet stillness of their new beginning. Then, Yancey pulled her into his arms, kissing her with all the passion he had restrained throughout the day. Beatrice responded in kind, her body awakening to sensations she had only imagined in her most private thoughts. Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Beatrice rested her head on Yancey's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Read me something," he murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. "One of your poems." "Now?" she asked, smiling against his skin. He confirmed. "I love the sound of your voice when you read your own words. It's like hearing two beautiful things at once." She propped herself up on one elbow, considering. Then, in the intimate darkness, she recited from memory a poem she had written just days ago, but hadn't yet shared with him, a poem about desire and fulfillment, about two bodies learning each other's landscapes, about love that was both earthly and transcendent. When she finished, the silence between them was charged with emotion. Yancey drew her back down to him, kissing her with a reverence that made her feel both powerful and deeply cherished. "Write me more," he whispered against her lips. "Always write me more." Spring arrived in a burst of desert blooms, transforming the landscape around Yuma with brief but intense color. With it came the publication of Beatrice's book, Desert Whispers. The day the first copy arrived by post was one she would never forget. She stood in their kitchen, staring at the slim volume with her name on the cover, scarcely able to believe it was real. Yancey watched her from the doorway, his face alight with pride. "Open it," he encouraged. "See your words in print." With trembling hands, she opened the book to the dedication page and read aloud. "To Y.D., who listened when others would not, who saw value in what others dismissed, who loved both the poet and her poetry. And to the memory of my father, who taught me that words have power." Tears blurred her vision as she looked up at her husband. "I can't believe it's real." "Believe it," he said, crossing the room to embrace her. "Your words are out in the world now, touching people you've never met, showing them the beauty you see." The book received positive reviews in several Eastern newspapers, with critics praising Beatrice's fresh perspective on frontier life and her evocative imagery. Orders came in steadily enough that Harper and Brothers sent word they were considering a second printing before the year's end. Locally, the reception was mixed but increasingly favorable. Some in Yuma still considered poetry a frivolous pursuit, but many took pride in having a published author in their midst, especially one whose work was garnering national attention. The same people who had once mockingly called her verses foolish now asked her to sign copies of her book. Life settled into a pleasant rhythm for the Donovans. Yancey's work with the cattle company prospered, eventually leading to a full management position with a corresponding increase in salary. Beatrice continued to write, finding that marriage and domestic responsibilities didn't diminish her creativity, but rather gave her new perspectives to explore in her poetry. In the spring of 1880, just over a year after their wedding, Beatrice discovered she was expecting their first child. The news filled both of them with joy and a touch of apprehension. "What if I can't write anymore once the baby comes?" Beatrice confided her fear to Yancey one evening as they sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. "You'll write," he assured her, his hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. "Maybe differently, maybe at different times of day, but you'll find a way. Your poetry isn't something separate from your life, Beatrice. It's how you process your experiences, how you make meaning of the world. Having a child will give you new experiences, new meanings to explore. She leaned against his shoulder, grateful for his understanding. How did I get so fortunate to find a man who values my writing as much as I do? I think I'm the fortunate one, he replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. To be loved by a woman whose words can make the desert bloom. Their son, James William Donovan, was born in December of that year, a healthy baby with his father's green eyes and his mother's dark hair. Beatrice discovered that, while the demands of motherhood did indeed change her writing habits, they also deepened her work, adding new dimensions of love and wonder to her poetry. She would write during James's naps, or in the quiet early morning hours before the household stirred, filling the pages of the journal Yancey had given her with observations about her son's tiny fingers and the profound experience of nurturing a new life. Yancey took on extra duties in the evening to give her time to work, understanding without being told how essential writing was to her well-being. By the time James was 2, Harper and Brothers had published Beatrice's second collection, Frontier Mother, which explored the intersection of motherhood and pioneer life. It sold even better than her first book, establishing her as a voice of significance in American poetry. In 1883, their family expanded again with the birth of their daughter, Elizabeth Martha Donovan, named for both their mothers. With 2 small children, life became busier and more chaotic, but also richer in the small, beautiful moments that Beatrice captured in her work. The town of Yuma grew alongside the Donovan family, the railroad bringing new opportunities and new residents. Beatrice occasionally gave readings at the small library that had been established, and she corresponded regularly with other writers across the country, becoming part of a literary community that transcended the physical isolation of frontier life. Yancey's career continued to advance, eventually leading to an offer to become a partner in the cattle company, an opportunity that provided financial security beyond what either of them had imagined possible when they married. They were able to build a larger home, with a dedicated space for Beatrice to write and enough room for their growing family. Yet despite their improving circumstances, they remained grounded in what truly mattered to them: their love for each other, their children, and the shared respect for each other's work and dreams. Yancey still asked Beatrice to read her poems aloud to him, still carried copies of his favorites in his pocket when he traveled for business, still whispered, "Write me more," in quiet moments between them. On a warm evening in May 1888, as they celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary, Beatrice presented Yancey with a special gift, a custom printed volume containing all the poems she had written for him over the years, from that first verse about the desert speaking in whispers, the most recent ones about the life they had built together. He paged through it slowly, memory and emotion playing across his features as he recognized poems from their courtship, their early marriage, the births of their children, moments of both joy and hardship they had weathered together. "This is my real legacy," Beatrice said softly as he read. "Not the published collections or the reviews or any recognition I might receive. These words, written for you about us, this is what I want to endure." Yancey looked up at her, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "It will endure, Beatrice. In our children, in the life we've made, in the hearts of everyone who reads your work and sees the world differently because of it." He set the book aside carefully and took her hands in his. 10 years ago, the whole town called your poetry foolish. They couldn't see its value, couldn't understand its beauty. But I knew, from that very first poem I read, that your words held something precious: truth and heart, and a way of seeing that changed how I experienced the world. Beatrice squeezed his hands, her own vision blurring with tears. You gave me the courage to keep writing when everyone else told me to stop. You believed in me when I barely believed in myself. And I always will, he promised. For as long as I live, I'll be asking you to write me more. As the stars appeared in the desert sky above their home, Beatrice thought about the unlikely journey that had brought them to this moment, a poem carried by the wind, a cowboy who took the time to read it, a love that had grown from shared words into a shared life. It was, she realized, the most beautiful poem she had ever been part of, and one that would continue to unfold, verse by verse, in the years to come.